For years I searched my memories, convinced there had to be one defining instant when everything inside me first made sense. I imagined there must have been a single conversation, a single glance, a single choice that divided my life into before and after. But memory doesn't work like that. Identity isn't born in a dramatic flash. It gathers quietly, almost invisibly, through countless ordinary moments that only reveal their meaning when viewed from far away. I grew up between two siblings, an older sister who seemed to carry effortless confidence wherever she went and a younger brother who naturally became the center of everyone's attention. As the child in the middle, I often felt less like a person shaping my own story and more like someone trying to fit into a role already written for me. The name I received at birth never settled comfortably inside me. It wasn't that I disliked it, it simply felt disconnected, as though it belonged to someone standing just a few steps ahead of me while I spent years trying to catch up. One of my earliest memories is sitting cross-legged on the bathroom floor while my mother prepared my sister for a family gathering. She carefully brushed her hair, tied ribbons through it, and fussed over every detail with remarkable patience. I remember watching those gentle movements with quiet fascination. It wasn't merely the hairstyle that caught my attention. It was the tenderness, the feeling of being seen, the transformation that seemed to happen beneath my mother's careful hands. I wanted to be part of that moment. When I asked if she could do my hair too, she smiled warmly, ruffled my short hair, and laughed that there wasn't enough of it yet. Maybe someday, she said before moving on to the endless list of things parents always have waiting for them. She probably forgot those words within minutes. I never did. My father believed life made the most sense when everyone knew where they belonged. He wasn't harsh or angry, he simply trusted clear rules. Boys had their place. Girls had theirs. Those ideas quietly shaped our household without needing to be spoken every day. My sister's bedroom overflowed with soft colors, dolls, ribbons, and little treasures collected over birthdays and holidays. Mine was decorated with race cars, dinosaurs, maps, and toy rockets. None of those gifts were unwanted. I enjoyed them because they were given with love. Yet whenever I wandered into my sister's room, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me, as though some restless part of myself had finally stopped searching. Halloween remains one of the clearest memories from my childhood. That year my mother allowed each of us to choose our own costume. My sister excitedly picked a witch's outfit. My toddler brother became a cheerful pumpkin without much say in the matter. While wandering through the costume aisle, my eyes landed on a sparkling blue princess gown hanging among the racks. I stared at it longer than I should have. I never reached for it. Without anyone saying a word, I already understood there were certain desires that belonged only in silence. Instead I grabbed the nearest pirate costume, mostly because choosing it required no explanation. The photographs from that Halloween show exactly what everyone expected to see, a smiling little pirate with a toy sword and a wide grin. No photograph captured the disappointment I carried home that evening. Something inside me became quieter after that, not broken, simply quieter. A small voice that had once spoken freely learned to whisper instead. As the years passed, I became so accustomed to that whisper that it blended into everyday life. It surfaced unexpectedly in moments that seemed unrelated. During elementary school we learned about ancient Egypt, and our teacher explained that cosmetics and jewelry weren't divided by gender in the same way modern society often treated them. I remember feeling an unexpected rush of excitement. For a brief moment, history suggested another way the world could exist. At a cousin's wedding my sister grumbled endlessly about having to wear a dress. I smiled politely while secretly thinking I would have traded places with her without hesitation. Our extended family was close-knit, loud, affectionate, and full of traditions. Gatherings filled nearly every holiday and birthday, sometimes happening for no reason beyond the simple joy of being together. My grandmother, my father's mother, was admired by everyone. After losing her husband at a young age, she raised 5 children with determination that bordered on legendary. She loved deeply but believed equally deeply in strength, resilience, and traditional ideas about what boys should become. One afternoon after I cried over something trivial, a scraped knee, perhaps, or a broken toy, she gently reminded me that the men in our family didn't wear their emotions openly. They carried their burdens quietly. At the time, it sounded like practical advice. Only years later did I understand I had been learning something much larger, how to perform an identity that felt increasingly distant from my own. So I became skilled at performing. I joined sports because my father enrolled me. I made friends. I rode bicycles until sunset, played video games, argued over silly things, and laughed when everyone else laughed. Outwardly, I was an ordinary boy growing into adolescence. Privately, another part of me continued asking questions I couldn't answer. Whenever the house stood empty, I sometimes slipped into my sister's room. Carefully, almost ceremonially, I tried on clothes that weren't mine. Each time I promised myself it was nothing more than curiosity. Yet every time I caught my reflection, I experienced a feeling unlike anything else in my childhood. Not excitement exactly, and not guilt either. It felt closer to recognition, like hearing a familiar melody you hadn't realized you'd been searching for. Before anyone returned home, I folded everything neatly and placed it exactly where it belonged. Then I tried to convince myself none of it mattered. Secrets have a strange weight. They grow heavier not because they change, but because carrying them requires constant effort. By the time I entered middle school, those quiet moments had become both comforting and frightening. Comforting because they brought an indescribable sense of peace. Frightening because I worried about what they might reveal. Night after night I made promises to myself that I would stop, that tomorrow would be different. Yet before long I would find myself repeating the same careful ritual, pulled toward a truth I couldn't yet bring myself to examine directly. My sister, meanwhile, seemed to notice far more than I realized. 3 years older than me, she was becoming increasingly confident in herself. She never confronted me or asked difficult questions, but there were moments when our eyes met and I wondered whether she recognized something I was still struggling to name within myself. There was a day I believed my secret had finally reached its end. She wasn't supposed to be home. I had wandered into her room, not to steal anything or even to wear anything, but simply to exist among the things that seemed to belong to a life I couldn't explain wanting. I stood in front of her closet for what felt like hours, tracing fabrics with my eyes, imagining a version of myself I had never dared let breathe. Then the front door opened. My heart stopped before my body did. She appeared in the doorway, surprise crossing her face. I was certain the shouting would come next. I imagined accusations, parents being called, every carefully built wall collapsing in an instant. Instead, she asked one question. "Are you okay?" The kindness in her voice shattered me more completely than anger ever could have. I lied. I muttered something about looking for a book I thought I'd left in her room. She looked unconvinced, but she nodded anyway. She never mentioned it again. Years later I realized her silence wasn't ignorance. It was mercy. Middle school taught me something cruel about children. They often recognize difference long before they understand it. I wasn't the obvious target. I had already become remarkably skilled at acting. I knew how to lower my voice, how to move, how to laugh when everyone else laughed. I knew how to erase little pieces of myself before anyone else noticed them. But perfection is impossible. One afternoon I admired a girl's hair clip without thinking. It wasn't what I said, it was how naturally I said it. The boys nearby exchanged glances. Someone laughed. Not viciously. Almost casually. As if I had accidentally spoken a language nobody expected me to know. From that day forward I watched everything. Where my eyes rested. How I crossed my legs. How I talked. How long I looked at pretty things before forcing myself to look away. Little by little I became my own prison guard. Around 13 or 14 something happened that changed me forever. While visiting my aunt, she happened to be watching a documentary about transgender people. Until then I'd only heard that word used as a joke. This was different. The people on television described knowing from childhood that something inside them didn't match the role the world insisted they play. Every sentence landed inside me like it had been written from my own memories. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I simply watched. That night, lying awake in the guest room, I buried my face in a pillow and cried harder than I had in years. Not because everything suddenly made sense. Because for the first time I realized I wasn't imagining it. Someone else had carried this feeling too. Understanding yourself isn't lightning. It's sunrise. The darkness doesn't disappear all at once. Pieces of the landscape slowly reveal themselves while others remain hidden. For years I drifted between acceptance and denial. Some days I admitted the truth privately. Other days I convinced myself it was fantasy. Hope and fear took turns steering my life. High school demanded another performance. My father wanted a football player. So I became one. I wasn't extraordinary, but I was good enough. Good enough to make him proud. Good enough to keep questions away. The locker room became another stage. Conversations about girls. Jokes that never felt funny. Competition over who could appear toughest. I memoized every line. Played every scene. And every afternoon I returned home feeling strangely empty. The exhaustion wasn't physical. It came from spending every waking hour pretending to be someone who required constant maintenance. Everything began changing because of one ordinary question. My sister had started college by then. She seemed different each time she visited. More open. More curious. Less interested in pretending life fit into neat little boxes. One night we stayed awake talking until well after midnight. Eventually she looked at me and asked, "Are you happy?" I opened my mouth automatically. "I'm fine." Those words were ready. But they never came out. Instead, after what felt like forever, I whispered, "I don't know." That was the first honest sentence I'd spoken about myself in years. I didn't tell her everything. Only fragments. That I constantly felt like I was acting. That parts of myself felt strangely distant. That I couldn't explain why. She listened without interrupting. When I finally fell silent, she reached across the space between us and squeezed my hand. "Whatever this turns out to be," she said, "you won't figure it out alone." For the first time in my life, the weight I carried belonged to more than one person. She never rushed me. She never insisted on labels. She simply made room for honesty. Months later she suggested I try wearing something from her closet. Not to prove anything, not to decide anything, simply to experience what felt right. I was terrified. Not because I might be caught. Because someone would truly see me. When I finally stepped into the room, she studied me quietly. Then she smiled. "There you are." At the time I thought she meant the clothes suited me. Years later I understood. She had recognized something deeper. For the first time, I looked comfortable inside my own skin. Self-discovery carries an unexpected companion. Grief. Grief for every version of yourself that survived by disappearing. Grief for the child staring at ribbons with silent longing. Grief for the Halloween costume you chose because wanting anything else felt impossible. Grief for all the birthdays, school photos, and ordinary afternoons spent pretending. Yet alongside that grief came possibility. I noticed how certain fabrics made me feel lighter. How imagining my future no longer filled me only with dread. How hope slowly became louder than fear. My mother noticed before I ever confessed. Not because she found evidence. Because mothers often recognize changes that words haven't caught up to. One evening she sat across from me at the kitchen table. The room looked exactly like it always had. Nothing about the setting hinted that my life was about to change. She asked quietly, "Is there something you've been carrying by yourself?" This time I didn't lie. I told her everything. The ribbons. The costumes. The secret rituals. The documentary. The tears. The years spent hiding from myself. She cried while I spoke. Watching her cry terrified me. I thought I had broken her heart. Instead she said, "I'm not crying because of who you are." She paused. "I'm crying because you've been hurting this long, and I never knew." That sentence healed something I hadn't realized was still bleeding. My father struggled. Love was still there. Understanding wasn't. For months our relationship became strangely polite. We talked about weather, sports, work, anything except the truth standing silently between us. Distance can hurt more than arguments. Arguments still acknowledge someone's presence. Silence sometimes feels like disappearance. Time became our translator. Slowly, awkwardly, painfully, we learned new ways to speak to one another. The biggest surprise came from my grandmother. As a child I'd believed she represented every old expectation our family carried. When she finally learned everything, she didn't lecture me. She reflected on her own life. She admitted she'd spent decades living according to expectations she had never chosen. "I don't want another generation making that sacrifice," she said. Her acceptance wasn't only about me. It was about freeing both of us from different cages. Life afterward wasn't magically easier. Some friendships quietly dissolved. Not through hatred. Simply because some people only knew how to love the version of me they had invented. Losing them hurt. Even necessary endings leave bruises. But new beginnings arrived too. The first time I walked outside dressed in a way that genuinely reflected who I felt I was, I expected every stranger to stare. Nobody did. The world kept moving. Cars drove past. People checked their phones. Someone walked a dog. I realized I'd spent years fearing an audience that barely existed. That realization felt wonderfully ordinary. Telling my younger brother was almost anticlimactic. He listened. Thought for a second. Then shrugged. So, does this mean I can borrow clothes from both closets now? I laughed harder than I had in years. Because underneath the joke was complete acceptance. No speeches. No drama. Just family. Sometimes I still think about that little child sitting on a bathroom floor watching ribbons slip through gentle hands. That child believed longing had to remain silent forever. They couldn't imagine a future where whispers became conversations. Where fear became honesty. Where survival slowly transformed into living. Nothing changed overnight. My life wasn't rebuilt in one dramatic confession. It was shaped by countless quiet moments. A sister who chose compassion over suspicion. A mother who mourned my loneliness instead of my identity. A father who needed time. A grandmother willing to question generations of tradition. A brother who answered vulnerability with laughter. Those moments accumulated like drops of rain filling an empty riverbed. Today fear still visits. Some scars never disappear completely. The difference is that fear no longer decides where my life goes. Something steadier sits in its place now. Something built from truth rather than performance. And after years spent trying to become the person everyone expected, I finally understand the greatest surprise of all. I never became someone new. I simply stopped hiding the person who had been there all along.